The ordinary idea which we all have before we become Christians is this. We take as the starting point our ordinary self with its various desires and interests. We then admit that something else, call it morality or decent behavior or the good of society, has claims on this self, claims which interfere with its own desires. What we mean by being good is giving in to those claims. Some of the things the ordinary self wanted to do turn out to be what we call wrong. Well, we must give them up. Other things turn out to be what we call right. Well, we shall have to do them. But we are hoping all the time that when all the demands have been met, the poor natural self will still have some chance and some time to get on with its own life and do what it likes. In fact, we are very like an honest man. Paying his taxes, he pays them all right. But he does hope that there will be enough left over for him to live on, because we are still taking our natural self as the starting point. As long as we are thinking that way, one or the other of two results is likely to follow. Either we give up trying to be good, or else we become very unhappy indeed. For make no mistake, if you are really going to try to meet all the demands made on the natural self, it will not have enough left over to live on. The more you obey your conscience, the more your conscience will demand of you. And your natural self, which is thus being starved and hampered and worried at every turn, will get angrier and angrier. In the end, you will either give up trying to be good, or else become one of those people who, as they say, live for others, but always in a discontented, grumbling way, always wondering why the others do not notice it more, and always making a martyr of yourself. And once you have become that, you will be a far greater pest to anyone who has to live with you than you would have been if you had remained, frankly, selfish. The Christian way is different, harder and easier. Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones you think wicked, the whole outfit. I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own will shall become yours. Both harder and easier than what we are all trying to do. You have noticed, I expect, that Christ himself sometimes describes the Christian way as very hard, sometimes as very easy. He says, take up your cross. In other words, it is like going to be beaten to death in a concentration camp. Next minute he says, my yoke is easy and my burden light. He means both. And one can just see why both are true. Teachers will tell you that the laziest boy in the class is the one who works the hardest in the end. They mean this. If you give two boys, say, a proposition in geometry to do, the one who is prepared to take trouble will try to understand it. The lazy boy will learn it by heart because, for the moment, that needs less effort. But 6 months later, when they are preparing for the exam, that lazy boy is doing hours and hours of miserable drudgery over things the other boy understands and positively enjoys in a few minutes. Laziness means more work in the long run. Or look at it this way. In a battle or in mountain climbing, there is often one thing which it takes a lot of pluck to do, but it is also in the long run the safest thing to do. If you funk it, you will find yourself hours later in far worse danger. The cowardly thing is also the most dangerous thing. It is like that here. The terrible thing, the almost impossible thing, is to hand over your whole self, all your wishes and precautions, to Christ. But it is far easier than what we are trying to do instead. For what we are trying to do is to remain what we call ourselves, to keep personal happiness as our great aim in life, and yet at the same time be good. We are all trying to let our mind and heart go their own way, centered on money or pleasure or ambition, and hoping, in spite of this, to behave honestly and chastely and humbly. And that is exactly what Christ warned us you could not do. As he said, a thistle cannot produce figs. If I am a field that contains nothing but grass seed, I cannot produce wheat. Cutting the grass may keep it short, but I shall still produce grass and no wheat. If I want to produce wheat, the change must go deeper than the surface. I must be plowed up and resown. That is why the real problem of the Christian life comes where people do not usually look for it. It comes the very moment you wake up each morning. All your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals. And the first job each morning consists simply in shoving them all back, in listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. And so on all day, standing back from all your natural fussings and frettings, coming in out of the wind. We can only do it for moments at first, but from those moments the new sort of life will be spreading through our system, because now we are letting him work at the right part of us. It is the difference between paint, which is merely laid on the surface, and a dye or stain which soaks right through. He never talked vague, idealistic gas. When he said, be perfect, he meant it. He meant that we must go in for the full treatment. It is hard, but the sort of compromise we are all hankering after is harder. In fact, it is impossible. It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight, harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We are like eggs at present. You cannot go on indefinitely being just an ordinary, decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. May I come back to what I said before? This is the whole of Christianity. There is nothing else. It is so easy to get muddled about that. It is easy to think that the church has a lot of different objects: education, building, missions, holding services. Just as it is easy to think the state has a lot of different objects: military, political, economic, and whatnot. But in a way, things are much simpler than that. The state exists simply to promote and to protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. A husband and wife chatting over a fire, a couple of friends having a game of darts in a pub, a man reading a book in his own room or digging in his own garden. That is what the state is there for. And unless they are helping to increase and prolong and protect such moments, all the laws, parliaments, armies, courts, police, economics, etc., are simply a waste of time. In the same way, the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, mission sermons, even the Bible itself, are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. It is even doubtful, whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. It says in the Bible that the whole universe was made for Christ and that everything is to be gathered together in him. I do not suppose any of us can understand how this will happen as regards the whole universe. We do not know what, if anything, lives in the parts of it that are millions of miles from this earth. Even on this earth, we do not know how it applies to things other than men. After all, that is what you would expect. We have been shown the plan only insofar as it concerns ourselves. What we have been told is how we can be drawn into Christ, can become part of that wonderful present which the young prince of the universe wants to offer his Father, that present which is himself, and therefore us in him. It is the only thing we were made for. And there are strange, exciting hints in the Bible that when we are drawn in, a great many other things in nature will begin to come right. The bad dream will be over. It will be morning. Good works, in the plural, is an expression much more familiar to modern Christendom than good work. Good works are chiefly almsgiving or helping in the parish. They are quite separate from one's work. And good works need not be good work, as anyone can see by inspecting some of the objects made to be sold at bazaars for charitable purposes. This is not according to our example. When our Lord provided a poor wedding party with an extra glass of wine all round, he was doing good works, but also good work. It was a wine really worth drinking. Nor is the neglect of goodness in our work our job according to precept. The apostle says everyone must not only work, but work to produce what is good. The idea of good work is not quite extinct among us, though it is not, I fear, especially characteristic of religious people. I have found it among cabinet makers, cobblers, and sailors. It is no use at all trying to impress sailors with a new liner because she is the biggest or costliest ship afloat. They look for what they call her lines. They predict how she will behave in a heavy sea. Artists also talk of good work, but decreasingly. They begin to prefer words like significant, important, contemporary, or daring. These are not, to my mind, good symptoms, but the great mass of men in all fully industrialized societies are the victims of a situation which almost excludes the idea of good work from the outset. Built-in obsolescence becomes an economic necessity. Unless an article is so made that it will go to pieces in a year or two, and thus have to be replaced, you will not get a sufficient turnover. 100 years ago, when a man got married, he had built for him, if he were rich enough, a carriage in which he expected to drive for the rest of his life. He now buys a car which he expects to sell again in 2 years. Work nowadays must not be good. For the wearer, zip fasteners have this advantage over buttons that, while they last, they will save him an infinitesimal amount of time and trouble. For the producer, they have a much more solid merit. They don't remain in working order long. Bad work is the desideratum. We must avoid taking a glibly moral view of this situation. It is not solely the result of original or actual sin. It has stolen upon us, unforeseen and unintended, the degraded commercialism of our minds is quite as much its result as its cause. Nor can it, in my opinion, be cured by purely moral efforts. Originally, things are made for use or delight, or more often for both. The savage hunter makes himself a weapon of flint or bone, makes it as well as he can, for if it is blunt or brittle, he will kill no meat. His woman makes a clay pot to fetch water in, again as well as she can, for she will have to use it. But they do not for long, if at all, abstain from decorating these things. They want to have, like Dogberry, everything handsome about them. And while they work, we may be sure they sing or whistle, or at least hum. They may tell stories, too. Into this situation, unobtrusive as Eden's snake, and at first as innocent as that snake once was, there must sooner or later come a change. Each family no longer makes all it needs. There is a specialist, a potter making pots for the whole village, a smith making weapons for all, a bard, poet, and musician in one, singing and storytelling for all. It is significant that in Homer, the smith of the gods is lame, and the poet among men is blind. That may be how the thing began. The defectives, who are no use as hunters or warriors, may be set aside to provide both necessaries and recreation for those who are. The importance of this change is that we now have people making things, pots, swords, lays, not for their own use and delight, but for the use and delight of others. And of course, they must, in some way or other, be rewarded for doing it. The change is necessary unless society and arts are to remain in a state not of paradisal, but of feeble, blundering, and impoverishing simplicity. It is kept healthy by two facts. First, these specialists will do their work as well as they can. They are right up against the people who are going to use it. You'll have all the women in the village after you if you make bad pots. You'll be shouted down if you sing a dull lay. If you make bad swords, then at best the warriors will come back and thrash you. At worst, they won't come back at all, for the enemy will have killed them, and your village will be burned, and you yourself enslaved or knocked on the head. And secondly, because the specialists are doing as well as they can something that is indisputably worth doing, they will delight in their work. We must not idealize. It will not all be delight. The smith may be overworked. The bard may be frustrated when the village insists on hearing his last lay over again, or a new one exactly like it, while he is longing to get a hearing for some wonderful innovation. But by and large, the specialists have a life fit for a man, usefulness, a reasonable amount of honor, and the joy of exercising skill. I lack space and, of course, knowledge to trace the whole process from this state of affairs to that in which we are living today. But I think we can now disengage the essence of the change. Granted the departure from the primitive condition in which everyone makes things for himself, and granted, therefore, a condition in which many work for others who will pay them, there are still two sorts of job. Of one sort, a man can truly say, I am doing work which is worth doing. It would still be worth doing if nobody paid for it. But as I have no private means and need to be fed and housed and clothed, I must be paid while I do it. The other kind of job is that in which people do well, whose sole purpose is the earning of money, work which need not be, ought not to be, or would not be, done by anyone in the whole world unless it were paid. We may thank God there are still plenty of jobs in the first category. The agricultural laborer, the policeman, the doctor, the artist, the teacher, the priest, and many others are doing what is worth doing in itself. What quite a number of people would do, and do, without pay. What every family would attempt to do for itself in some amateurish fashion if it lived in primitive isolation. Of course, jobs of this kind need not be agreeable. Ministering to a leper settlement is one of them. The opposite extreme may be represented by two examples. I do not necessarily equate them morally, but they are alike by our present classification. One is the work of the professional prostitute, the peculiar horror of her work. If you say we should not call it work, think again. The thing that makes it so much more horrible than ordinary fornication is that it is an extreme example of an activity which has no possible end in view except money. You cannot go further in that direction than sexual intercourse, not only without marriage, not only without love, but even without lust. My other example is this. I often see a hoarding which bears a notice to the effect that thousands look at this space and your firm ought to hire it for an advertisement of its wares. Consider by how many stages this is separated from making that which is good. A carpenter has made this hoarding. That in itself has no use. Printers and paper makers have worked to produce the notice, worthless until someone hires the space, worthless to him until he pastes on it. Another notice, still worthless to him unless it persuades someone else to buy his goods, which themselves may well be ugly, useless, and pernicious luxuries that no mortal would have bought unless the advertisement, by its sexy or snobbish incantations, had conjured up in him a factitious desire for them. At every stage of the process, work is being done whose sole value lies in the money it brings. Such would seem to be the inevitable result of a society which depends predominantly on buying and selling. In a rational world, things would be made because they were wanted. In the actual world, wants have to be created in order that people may receive money for making these things. That is why the distrusts or contempt of trade which we find in earlier societies should not be too hastily set down as mere snobbery. The more important trade is, the more people are condemned to. And, worse still, Lernberufe, what we have called the second kind of job. Work worth doing apart from its pay, enjoyable work, and good work become the privilege of a fortunate minority. The competitive search for customers dominates international situations. Within my lifetime in England, money was very properly collected to buy shirts for some men who were out of work. The work they were out of was the manufacture of shirts. That such a state of affairs cannot be permanent is easily foreseen. But unfortunately, it is most likely to perish by its own internal contradictions in a manner which will cause immense suffering. It can be ended painlessly only if we find some way of ending it voluntarily. And needless to say, I have no plan for doing that. And none of our masters, the big men behind government and industry, would take any notice if I had. The only hopeful sign at the moment is the space race between America and Russia. Since we have got ourselves into a state where the main problem is not to provide people with what they need or like, but to keep people making things, it hardly matters what. Great powers could not easily be better employed than in fabricating costly objects which they then fling overboard. It keeps money circulating and factories working, and it won't do space much harm. or not for a long time. But the relief is partial and temporary. The main practical task for most of us is not to give the big men advice about how to end our fatal economy. We have none to give, and they wouldn't listen. But to consider how we can live within it as little hurt and degraded as possible. It is something even to recognize that it is fatal and insane. Just as the Christian has a great advantage over other men, not by being less fallen than they, nor less doomed to live in a fallen world, but by knowing that he is a fallen man in a fallen world. So we shall do better if we remember at every moment what good work was and how impossible it has now become for the majority. We may have to earn our living by taking part in the production of objects which are rotten in quality and which, even if they were good in quality, would not be worth producing. The demand or market for them having been simply engineered by advertisement. Beside the waters of Babylon or the assembly belt, we shall still say inwardly, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning." It will. And of course, we shall keep our eyes skinned for any chance of escape. If we have any choice of a career, but has one man in 1,000 any such thing, we shall be after the sane jobs, like greyhounds, and stick there like limpets. We shall try, if we get the chance, to earn our living by doing well what would be worth doing, even if we had not our living to earn. A considerable mortification of our avarice may be necessary. It is usually the insane jobs that lead to big money. They are often also the least laborious. But beyond all this, there is something subtler. We must take great care to preserve our habits of mind from infection by those which the situation has bred. Such an infection has, in my opinion, deeply corrupted our artists. Until quite recently, until the latter part of the last century, it was taken for granted that the business of the artist was to delight and instruct his public. There were, of course, different publics. The street songs and the oratorios were not addressed to the same audience, though I think a good many people liked both. And an artist might lead his public on to appreciate finer things than they had wanted at first. But he could do this only by being, from the first, if not merely entertaining, yet entertaining, and if not completely intelligible, yet very largely intelligible. All this has changed. In the highest aesthetic circles, one now hears nothing about the artist's duty to us. It is all about our duty to him. He owes us nothing. We owe him recognition, even though he has never paid the slightest attention to our tastes, interests, or habits. If we don't give it to him, our name is mud. In this shop, the customer is always wrong. But this change is surely part of our changed attitude to all work. As giving employment becomes more important than making things men need or like, there is a tendency to regard every trade as something that exists chiefly for the sake of those who practice it. The smith does not work in order that the warriors may fight. The warriors exist and fight in order that the smith may be kept busy. The bard does not exist in order to delight the tribe. The tribe exists in order to appreciate the bard. In industry, highly creditable motives, as well as insanity, lie behind this change of attitude. A real advance in charity stopped us talking about surplus population and started us talking instead about unemployment. The danger is that this should lead us to forget that employment is not an end in itself. We want people to be employed only as a means to their being fed, believing, whether rightly, who knows, that it is better to feed them even for making bad things badly than for doing nothing. But though we have a duty to feed the hungry, I doubt whether we have a duty to appreciate the ambitious. This attitude to art is fatal to good work. Many modern novels, poems, and pictures which we are browbeaten into appreciating are not good work, because they are not work at all. They are mere puddles of spilled sensibility or reflection. When an artist is in the strict sense working, he, of course, takes into account the existing taste, interest, and capacity of his audience. These, no less than the language, the marble, or the paint, are part of his raw material, to be used, tamed, sublimated, not ignored, nor defied. Haughty indifference to them is not genius nor integrity. It is laziness and incompetence. You have not learned your job. Hence, real, honest-to-God work, so far as the arts are concerned, now appears chiefly in lowbrow art, in the film, the detective story, the children's story. These are often sound structures, seasoned wood, accurately dovetailed, the stress is all calculated, skill and labor successfully used to do what is intended. Do not misunderstand. The highbrow productions may, of course, reveal a finer sensibility and profounder thought. But a puddle is not a work, whatever rich wines, oils, or medicines have gone into it. Great works of art and good works of charity had better also be good work. Let choirs sing well or not at all. Otherwise, we merely confirm the majority in their conviction that the world of business, which does with such efficiency so much that never really needed doing, is the real, the adult, and the practical world. And that all this culture and all this religion, horrid words both, are essentially marginal, amateurish, and rather effeminate activities. The Cambridge number of the 20th century, 1955. Mr. John Allen asked why so many people go to such lengths to prove to us that really they are not intellectuals at all, and certainly not cultured. I believe I know the answer. Two parallels may help to ease it into the reader's mind. We all know those who shudder at the word refinement as a term of social approval. Sometimes they express their dislike of this usage by facetiously spelling it refinement, with the implication that it is likely to be commonest in the mouths of those whose speech has a certain varnished vulgarity. And I suppose we can all understand the shudder, whether we approve it or not. He who shudders feels that the quality of mind and behavior, which we call refined, is nowhere less likely to occur than among those who aim at and talk much about refinement. Those who have this quality are not obeying any idea of refinement when they abstain from swaggering, spitting, snatching, triumphing, calling names, boasting, or contradicting. These modes of behavior do not occur to them as possible. If they did, that training and sensibility which constitute refinement would reject them as disagreeables without reference to any ideal of conduct, just as we reject the bad egg without reference to its possible effect on our stomachs. Refinement, in fact, is a name given to certain behavior from without. From within, it does not appear as refinement. Indeed, it does not appear, does not become an object of consciousness at all. Where it is most named, it is most absent. I produce my next parallel with many different kinds of reluctance. but I think it too illuminating to be omitted. The word religion is extremely rare in the New Testament or the writings of mystics. The reason is simple. Those attitudes and practices to which we give the collective name of religion are themselves concerned with religion hardly at all. To be religious is to have one's attention fixed on God and on one's neighbor in relation to God. Therefore, almost by definition, a religious man or a man, when he is being religious, is not thinking about religion. He hasn't the time. Religion is what we, or he himself at a later moment, call his activity from outside. Of course, those who disdain the words refinement and religion may be doing so from bad motive. They may wish to impress us with the idea that they are well-bred or holy. Such people are regarding chatter about refinement or religion simply as symptomatic of vulgarity or worldliness, and eschew the symptom to clear themselves from the suspicion of the disease. But there are others who sincerely, and I believe, rightly think that such talk is not merely a symptom of, but a cause active in producing that disease. The talk is inimical to the thing talked of, likely to spoil it where it exists, and to prevent its birth where it is unborn. Now, culture seems to belong to the same class of dangerous and embarrassing words. Whatever else it may mean, it certainly covers deep and genuine enjoyment of literature and the other arts. By using the word enjoyment, I do not mean to beg the vexed question about the role of pleasure in our experience of the arts. I mean fruit, not delectare, as we speak of a man enjoying good health or an estate. Now, if I am certain of anything in the world, I am certain that while a man is, in this sense, enjoying Don Giovanni or the Oresteia, he is not caring one farthing about culture. Culture. The irrelevance of it. For just as to be fat or clever means to be fatter or cleverer than most, so to be cultured must mean to be more so than most. And thus, the very word carries the mind at once to comparisons and groupings and life in society. And what has all that to do with the horns that blow as the statue enters? Or Clytemnestra crying, "Now you have named me aright." In Howard's End, Mr. E. M. Forster excellently describes a girl listening to a symphony. She's not thinking about culture, nor about music, nor even about this music. She sees the whole world through the music. Culture, like religion, is a name given from outside to activities which are not themselves interested in culture at all and would be ruined the moment they were. I do not mean that we are never to talk of things from the outside, but when the things are of high value and very easily destroyed, we must talk with great care, and perhaps the less we talk, the better. To be constantly engaged with the idea of culture, and above all, of culture as something enviable or meritorious or something that confers prestige, seems to me to endanger those very enjoyments for whose sake we chiefly value it. If we encourage others, or ourselves, to hear, see, or read great art on the ground that it is a cultured thing to do, we call into play precisely those elements in us which must be in abeyance before we can enjoy art at all. We are calling up the desire for self-improvement, the desire for distinction, the desire to revolt from one group and to agree with another, and a dozen busy passions which, whether good or bad in themselves, are, in relation to the arts, simply a blinding and paralyzing distraction. At this point, some may protest that by culture they do not mean the enjoyments themselves, but the whole habit of mind which such experiences, reacting upon one another and reflected on, build up as a permanent possession, and some will wish to include the sensitive and enriching social life which they think will arise among groups of people who share this habit of mind. But this reinterpretation leaves me with the same difficulty. I can well imagine a lifetime of such enjoyments leading a man to such a habit of mind, but on one condition, namely, that he went to the arts for no such purpose. Those who read poetry to improve their minds will never improve their minds by reading poetry, for the true enjoyments must be spontaneous and compulsive, and look to no remoter end. The muses will submit to no marriage of convenience. The desirable habit of mind, if it is to come at all, must come as a byproduct, unsought. The idea of making it one's aim suggests the shattering confidence which Goethe made to Eckermann. In all my youthful amours, the object I had in view was my own ennoblement. To this, I presume, most of us would reply that even if we believe a love affair can ennoble a young man, we feel sure that a love affair undertaken for that purpose would fail of its object, because, of course, it wouldn't be a love affair at all. So much for the individual. But the claims made for the cultured group raise an embarrassing question. What exactly is the evidence that culture produces among those who share it a sensitive and enriching social life? If by sensitive we mean sensitive to real or imagined affronts, a case could be made out. Horace noted long ago that bards are a touchy lot. The lives and writings of the Renaissance humanists and the correspondents in the most esteemed literary periodicals of our own century will show that critics and scholars are the same. But sensitive in that meaning cannot be combined with enriching. Competitive and resentful egoisms can only impoverish social life. The sensitivity that enriches must be of the sort that guards a man from wounding others, not of the sort that makes him ready to feel wounded himself. Between this sensitivity and culture, my own experience does not suggest any causal connection. I have often found it among the uncultured. Among the cultured, I have sometimes found it and sometimes not. Let us be honest. I claim to be one of the cultured myself and have no wish to foul my own nest. Even if that claim is disallowed, I have at least lived among them and would not denigrate my friends, but we are speaking here among ourselves, behind closed doors. Frankness is best. The real traitor to our order is not the man who speaks within that order of its faults, but the man who flatters our corporate self-complacency. I gladly admit that we number among us men and women whose modesty, courtesy, fair-mindedness, patience in disputation, and readiness to see an antagonist's point of view are wholly admirable. I am fortunate to have known them, but we must also admit that we show as high a percentage as any group whatever of bullies, paranoiacs, and poltroons, of backbiters, exhibitionists, mopes, milksops, and world-without-end bores. The lutenist that turns every argument into a quarrel is really no rarer among us than among the subliterate. The restless inferiority complex, stern to inflict, but not stubborn to endure, which bleeds at a touch but scratches like a wildcat, is almost as common among us as among schoolgirls. If you doubt this, try an experiment. Take any one of those who vaunt most highly the adjusting, cleansing, liberating, and civilizing effects of culture, and ask him about other poets, other critics, other scholars. Not in the mass, but one by one and name by name. 9 times out of 10, he will deny of each what he claimed for all. He will certainly produce very few cases in which, on his own showing, culture has had its boasted results. Sometimes we suspect that he can think of only one. The conclusion most naturally to be drawn from his remarks is that the praise our order can most securely claim is that which Dr. Johnson gave to the Irish. They are an honest people. They never speak well of one another. It is then, at best, extremely doubtful whether culture produces any of those qualities which will enable people to associate with one another graciously, loyally, understandingly, and with permanent delight. When Ovid said that it softened our manners, he was flattering a barbarian king. But even if culture did all these things, we could not embrace it for their sake. This would be to use consciously and self-consciously as means to extraneous ends, things which must lose all their power of conducing to those ends by the very fact of being so used. For many modern exponents of culture seem to me to be impudent in the etymological sense. They lack pudor, they have no shyness where men ought to be shy. They handle the most precious and fragile things with the roughness of an auctioneer and talk of our most intensely solitary and fugitive experiences as if they were selling us a Hoover. It is all really very well summed up in Mr. Allen's phrase in the 20th century, the faith in culture. A faith in culture is as bad as a faith in religion. Both expressions imply a turning away from those very things which culture and religion are about. Culture, as a collective name for certain very valuable activities, is a permissible word, but culture hypostatized, set up on its own, made into a faith, a cause, a banner, a platform, is unendurable. For none of the activities in question cares a straw for that faith or cause. It is like a return to early Semitic religion, where names themselves were regarded as powers. Now a step further. Mr. Allen complained that, not content with creeping out of earshot when we can bear the voices of certain culture mongers no longer, we then wantonly consort, or pretend that we consort, with the lowest of the low brows, and affect to share their pleasures. There are, at this point, still P127, a good many illusions which go over my head. I don't know what AAFN is. I am not fond of cellars, and modern whiskey suits neither my purse, my palate, nor my digestion. But I think I know the sort of thing he has in mind, and I think I can account for it. As before, I will begin with a parallel. Suppose you had spent an evening among very young and very transparent snobs who were feigning a discriminating enjoyment of a great port, though anyone who knew could see very well that, if they had ever drunk port in their lives before, it came from a grocer's. And then suppose that on your journey home, you went into a grubby little tea shop, and there heard an old body in a feather boa say to another old body, with a smack of her lips, "That was a nice cup of tea, dearie, that was. Did me good." Would you not, at that moment, feel that this was like fresh mountain air? For here, at last, would be something real. Here would be a mind really concerned about that in which it expressed concern. Here would be pleasure. Here would be undebauched experience, spontaneous and compulsive, from the fountainhead. A live dog is better than a dead lion. In the same way, after a certain kind of sherry party, where there have been cataracts of culture, but never one word or one glance that suggested a real enjoyment of any art any person, or any natural object, my heart warms to the schoolboy on the bus who is reading fantasy and science fiction, rapt and oblivious of all the world beside. For here also I should feel that I had met something real and lived and unfabricated. Genuine literary experience, spontaneous and compulsive, disinterested. I should have hopes of that boy. Those who have greatly cared for any book whatever may possibly come to care someday for good books. The organs of appreciation exist in them. They are not impotent. And even if this particular boy is never going to like anything severer than science fiction, even so, the child whose love is here at least doth reap one precious gain, that he forgets himself. I should still prefer the live dog to the dead lion, perhaps even the wild dog to the overtame poodle or peak. I should not have spent so many words on answering Mr. Allen's question. Neither of us matters sufficiently to justify it. Unless I thought that the discussion led to something of more consequence. This I will now try to develop. Mr. Forster feels anxious because he dreads theocracy. Now, if he expects to see a theocracy set up in modern England, I myself believe his expectation to be wholly chimerical. But I wish to make it very clear that if I thought the thing in the least probable, I should feel about it exactly as he does. I fully embrace the maxim, which he borrows from a Christian, that all power corrupts. I would go further. The loftier the pretensions of the power, the more meddlesome, inhuman, and oppressive it will be. Theocracy is the worst of all possible governments. All political power is at best a necessary evil, but it is least evil when its sanctions are most modest and commonplace, when it claims no more than to be useful or convenient and sets itself strictly limited objectives. Anything transcendental or spiritual, or even anything very strongly ethical in its pretensions is dangerous and encourages it to meddle with our private lives. Let the shoemaker stick to his last. Thus, the Renaissance doctrine of divine right is for me a corruption of monarchy. Rousseau's general will of democracy, racial mysticisms of nationality. And theocracy, I admit and even insist, is the worst corruption of all. But then, I don't think we are in any danger of it. What I think we are really in danger of is something that would be only 1 degree less intolerable, and intolerable in almost the same way. I would call it charientocracy. Not the rule of the saints, but the rule of the calientes, the venustiores, the hotel de Rambouillet, the wits, the polite, the souls, the apostles, the sensitive, the cultured, the integrated, or whatever the latest password may be. I will explain how I think it could come about. The old social classes have broken up. 2 results follow. On the one hand, since most men, as Aristotle observed, do not like to be merely equal with all other men, we find all sorts of people building themselves into groups within which they can feel superior to the mass. Little unofficial, self-appointed aristocracy. The cultured increasingly form such a group. Notice the tendency to use the social term vulgar of those who disagree with them. Notice that Mr. Allen spoke of rebels against, or deserters from, this group, as denying not that they are intellectual, but that they are intellectuals, not hiding equality, but deprecating inclusion in the class. On the other hand, inevitably, there is coming into existence a new real ruling class, what has been called the managerial class. The coalescence of these 2 groups, the unofficial, self-appointed aristocracy of the cultured and the actual managerial rulers, will bring us to charientocracy, But the two groups are already coalescing because education is increasingly the means of access to the managerial class. And of course, education, in some sense, is a very proper means of access. We do not want our rulers to be dunces. But education is coming to have a new significance. It aspires to do and can do far more to the pupil than education, except perhaps that of the Jesuits, has ever done before. For one thing, the pupil is now far more defenseless in the hands of his teachers. He comes increasingly from businessmen's flats or workmen's cottages in which there are few books or none. He has hardly ever been alone. The educational machine seizes him very early and organizes his whole life to the exclusion of all unsuperintended solitude or leisure. The hours of unsponsored, uninspected, perhaps even forbidden reading, the ramblings, and the long, long thoughts in which those of luckier generations first discovered literature and nature and themselves are a thing of the past. If a Traherne or a Wordsworth were born today, he would be cured before he was 12. In short, the modern pupil is the ideal patient for those masters who, not content with teaching a subject, would create a character. Helpless plasticity. Or if by chance, for nature will be nature, he should have any powers of resistance, they know how to deal with him. I am coming to that point in a moment. Secondly, the nature of the teaching has changed. In a sense, it has changed for the better. That is, it demands far more of the master, and in recompense makes his work more interesting. It has become far more intimate and penetrating, more inward. Not content with making sure that the pupil has read and remembered the text, it aspires to teach him appreciation. It seems harsh to quarrel with what at first sounds so reasonable an aim. Yet there is a danger in it. Everyone now laughs at the old test paper with its context questions and the like, and people ask, what good can that sort of thing do a boy? But surely to demand that the test paper should do the boy good is like demanding that a thermometer should heat a room. It was the reading of the text which was supposed to do the boy good. You set the paper to find out if he had read it. And just because the paper did not force the boy to produce or to feign appreciation, it left him free to develop in private, spontaneously, as an out-of-school activity which would never earn any marks, such appreciation as he could. That was a private affair between himself and Virgil, or himself and Shakespeare. 9 times out of 10, probably, nothing happened at all. But whenever appreciation did occur, and quite certainly it sometimes did, it was genuine, suited to the boy's age and character, no exotic but the healthy growth of its native soil and weather. But when we substitute exercises in practical criticism for the old dry papers, a new situation arises. The boy will not get good marks, which means in the long run that he will not get into the managerial class unless he produces the kind of responses and the kind of analytic method which commend themselves to his teacher. This means at best that he is trained to the precocious anticipation of responses and of a method inappropriate to his years. At worst, it means that he is trained in the not very difficult art of simulating the orthodox responses. For nearly all boys are good mimics. Depend upon it. Before you have been teaching for a term, everyone in the form knows pretty well the sort of stuff that goes down with prickly Popeye. In the crude old days, they knew that what went down, and the only thing that went down, was correct answers to factual questions, and there were only two ways of producing those, working or cheating. But the thing would not be so bad if the responses which the pupils had to make were even those of the individual master. But we have already passed that stage. Somewhere, I have not yet tracked it down, there must be a kind of culture mongers central bureau which keeps a sharp lookout for deviationists. At least there is certainly someone who sends little leaflets to schoolmasters, printing half a dozen poems on each, and telling the master not only which the pupils must be made to prefer, but exactly on what grounds. The impertinence of it. We know what Mulcaster or Boyer would have done with those leaflets. Thus to say that under the nascent regime, education alone will get you into the ruling class may not mean simply that the failure to acquire certain knowledge and to reach a certain level of intellectual competence will exclude you. That would be reasonable enough. But it may come to mean, perhaps means already, something more. It means that you cannot get in without becoming or without making your masters believe that you have become a very specific kind of person, one who makes the right responses to the right authors. In fact, you can get in only by becoming, in the modern sense of the word, cultured. This situation must be distinguished from one that has often occurred before. Nearly all ruling classes, sooner or later, in some degree or other, have taken up culture and patronized the arts. But when that happens, the culture is the result of their position, one of the luxuries or privileges of their order. The situation we are now facing will be almost the opposite. Entry into the ruling class will be the reward of culture. Thus we reach chariontocracy. Not only is the thing likely to happen, it is already planned and avowed. Mr. J.W. Saunders has set it all out in an excellent article entitled Poetry in the Managerial Age, Essays and Criticism, Ivo, 3 July 1954. He there faces the fact that modern poets are read almost exclusively by one another. He looks about for a remedy. Naturally, he does not suggest that the poets should do anything about it, for it is taken as basic by all the culture of our age that whenever artists and audience lose touch, the fault must be wholly on the side of the audience. I have never come across the great work in which this important doctrine is proved. The remedy which occurs to Mr. Saunders is that we should provide our poets with a conscript audience, a privilege last enjoyed, I believe, by Nero, and he tells us how this can be done. We get our coordinators through education. Success in examinations is the road into the ruling class. All that we need do, therefore, is to make not just poetry, but the intellectual discipline which the critical reading of poetry can foster, the backbone of our educational system. In other words, practical criticism, or something of the sort, exercised, no doubt, chiefly on modern poets, is to be the indispensable subject. Failure in which excludes you from the managerial class. And so our poets get their conscript readers. Every boy or girl who is born is presented with the choice. Read the poets whom we, the cultured, approve, and say the sort of things we say about them, or be a prole. And this, picking up a previous point, shows how chariontocracy can deal with the minority of pupils who have tastes of their own and are not pure plasticine. They get low marks. You kick them off the educational ladder at a low rung, and they disappear into the proletariat. Another advantage is that Besides providing poets with a conscript audience for the moment, you can make sure that the regnant literary dynasty will reign almost forever. For the deviationists whom you have kicked off the ladder will of course include all those troublesome types who, in earlier ages, were apt to start new schools and movements. If there had been a sound chariontocracy in their day, the young Chaucer, the young Donne, the young Wordsworth, and Coleridge could have been dealt with, and thus literary history, as we have known it in the past, may come to an end. Literary man, so long a wild animal, will have become a tame one. Having explained why I think a chariontocracy probable, I must conclude by explaining why I think it undesirable. Culture is a bad qualification for a ruling class because it does not qualify men to rule. The things we really need in our rulers, mercy, financial integrity, practical intelligence, hard work, and the like, are no more likely to be found in cultured persons than in anyone else. Culture is a bad qualification in the same way as sanctity. Both are hard to diagnose and easy to feign. Of course, not every chariontocrat will be a cultural hypocrite, nor every theocrat a tough. But both systems encourage hypocrisy and make the disinterested pursuit of the quality they profess to value more difficult. But hypocrisy is not the only evil they encourage. There are, as in piety, so in culture, states which, if less culpable, are no less disastrous. In the one we have the goody-goody, the docile youth who has neither revolted against nor risen above the routine pietisms and respectabilities of his home. His conformity has won the approval of his parents, his influential neighbors, and his own conscience. He does not know that he has missed anything and is content. In the other, we have the adaptable youth, to whom poetry has always been something set for evaluation. Success in this exercise has given him pleasure and let him into the ruling class. He does not know what he has missed, does not know that poetry ever had any other purpose, and is content. Both types are much to be pitied, but both can sometimes be very nasty. Both may exhibit spiritual pride, but each in its proper form, since the one has succeeded by acquiescence and repression, but the other by repeated victory in competitive performances. To the pride of the one, sly, simpering, and demure, we might apply Mr. Allen's word, smug, especially if we let in a little of its older sense. My epithet for the other would, I think, be swaggering. It tends, in my experience, to be raw, truculent, eager to give pain, insatiable in its demands for submission, resentful and suspicious of disagreement. Where the goody-goody slinks and sidles and purrs, and sometimes scratches, like a cat, his opposite number in the ranks of the cultured gobbles, like an enraged turkey. And perhaps both types are less curable than the hypocrite proper. A hypocrite might conceivably repent and mend, or he might be unmasked and rendered innocuous. But who could bring to repentance, and who can unmask those who were attempting no deception, who don't know that they are not the real thing, because they don't know that there ever was a real thing? Lastly, I reach the point where my objections to theocracy and to chariontocracy are almost identical. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. The higher the pretensions of our rulers are, the more meddlesome and impertinent their rule is likely to be, and the more the thing in whose name they rule will be defiled. The highest things have the most precarious foothold in our nature. By making sanctity or culture a moyen de parvenir, you help to drive them out of the world. Let our masters leave these two, at least, alone. Leave us some region where the spontaneous, the unmarketable, the utterly private can still exist. As far as I am concerned, Mr. Allen fell short of the mark when he spoke of a retreat from the faith in culture. I don't want retreat. I want attack, or, if you prefer the word rebellion, I write in the hope of rousing others to rebel. So far as I can see, the question has nothing to do with the difference between Christians and those who, unfortunately, since the word has long borne a useful and wholly different meaning, have been called humanists. I hope that red herring will not be brought in. I would gladly believe that many atheists and agnostics care for the things I care for. It is for them I have written. To them I say, the faith in culture is going to strangle all those things unless we can strangle it first. And there is no time to spare. Papers have more than once been read to the Socratic Club at Oxford, in which a contrast was drawn between a supposedly Christian attitude and a supposedly scientific attitude to belief. We have been told that the scientist thinks it his duty to proportion the strength of his belief exactly to the evidence, to believe less as there is less evidence, and to withdraw belief altogether when reliable adverse evidence turns up. We have been told that, on the contrary, the Christian regards it as positively praiseworthy to believe without evidence, or in excess of the evidence, or to maintain his belief unmodified in the teeth of steadily increasing evidence against it. Thus, a faith that has stood firm, which appears to mean a belief immune from all the assaults of reality, is commended. If this were a fair statement of the case, then the coexistence within the same species of such scientists and such Christians would be a very staggering phenomenon. The fact that the two classes appear to overlap, as they do, would be quite inexplicable. Certainly, all discussion between creatures so different would be hopeless. The purpose of this essay is to show that things are really not quite so bad as that. The sense in which scientists proportion their belief to the evidence, and the sense in which Christians do not, both need to be defined more closely. My hope is that when this has been done, though disagreement between the two parties may remain, they will not be left staring at one another in holy dumb and desperate incomprehension. And first, a word about belief in general. I do not see that the state of proportioning belief to evidence is anything like so common in the scientific life as has been claimed. Scientists are mainly concerned not with believing things, but with finding things out. And no one, to the best of my knowledge, uses the word believe about things he has found out. The doctor says he believes a man was poisoned before he has examined the body. After the examination, he says the man was poisoned. No one says that he believes the multiplication table. No one who catches a thief red-handed says he believes that man was stealing. The scientist, when at work, that is, when he is a scientist, is laboring to escape from belief and unbelief into knowledge. Of course, he uses hypotheses or supposals. I do not think these are beliefs. We must look, then, for the scientist's behavior about belief, not to his scientific life, but to his leisure hours. In actual modern English usage, the verb believe, except for two special usages, generally expresses a very weak degree of opinion. Where is Tom? Gone to London, I believe. The speaker would be only mildly surprised if Tom had not gone to London after all. What was the date? 430 BC, I believe. The speaker means that he is far from sure. It is the same with the negative if it is put in the form, I believe not. Is Jones coming up this term? I believe not. But if the negative is put in a different form, it then becomes one of the special usages I mentioned a moment ago. This is, of course, the form, I don't believe it, or the still stronger, I don't believe you. I don't believe it is far stronger on the negative side than I believe is on the positive. Where is Mrs. Jones? Eloped with the butler. I believe. I don't believe it. This, especially if said with anger, may imply a conviction which in subjective certitude might be hard to distinguish from knowledge by experience. The other special usage is I believe, as uttered by a Christian. There is no great difficulty in making the hardened materialist understand, however little he approves, the sort of mental attitude which this I believe expresses. The materialist need only picture himself replying to some report of a miracle. I don't believe it. And then imagine the same degree of conviction on the opposite side. He knows that he cannot there and then produce a refutation of the miracle which would have the certainty of mathematical demonstration, but the formal possibility that the miracle might, after all, have occurred does not really trouble him any more than a fear that water might not be H&O. Similarly, the Christian does not necessarily claim to have demonstrative proof, but the formal possibility that God might not exist is not necessarily present in the form of the least actual doubt. Of course, there are Christians who hold that such demonstrative proof exists, just as there may be materialists who hold that there is demonstrative disproof. But then, whichever of them is right, if either is, while he retained the proof or disproof, would be not believing or disbelieving, but knowing. We are speaking of belief and disbelief in the strongest degree, but not of knowledge. Belief in this sense seems to me to be assent to a proposition which we think so overwhelmingly probable that there is a psychological exclusion of doubt, though not a logical exclusion of dispute. It may be asked whether belief, and of course disbelief, of this sort ever attaches to any but theological propositions. I think that many beliefs approximate to it. That is, many probabilities seem to us so strong that the absence of logical certainty does not induce in us the least shade of doubt. The scientific beliefs of those who are not themselves scientists often have this character, especially among the uneducated. Most of our beliefs about other people are of the same sort. The scientist himself, or he who was a scientist in the laboratory, has beliefs about his wife and friends, which he holds, not indeed without evidence, but with more certitude than the evidence, if weighed in the laboratory manner, would justify. Most of my generation had a belief in the reality of the external world and of other people, if you prefer it, a disbelief in solipsism, far in excess of our strongest arguments. It may be true, as they now say, that the whole thing arose from category mistakes and was a pseudo-problem, but then we didn't know that in the 20s. Yet we managed to disbelieve in solipsism all the same. There is, of course, no question so far of belief without evidence. we must beware of confusion between the way in which a Christian first assents to certain propositions and the way in which he afterwards adheres to them. These must be carefully distinguished. Of the second, it is true, in a sense, to say that Christians do recommend a certain discounting of apparent contrary evidence, and I will later attempt to explain why. But so far as I know, it is not expected that a man should assent to these propositions in the first place without evidence, or in the teeth of the evidence. At any rate, if anyone expects that, I certainly do not. And in fact, the man who accepts Christianity always thinks he had good evidence, whether like Dante, physici e metaphysici argumenti, or historical evidence, or the evidence of religious experience, or authority, or all these together. For of course, authority, however we may value it in this or that particular instance, is a kind of evidence. All of our historical beliefs, most of our geographical beliefs, many of our beliefs about matters that concern us in daily life, are accepted on the authority of other human beings, whether we are Christians, atheists, scientists, or men in the street. It is not the purpose of this essay to weigh the evidence of whatever kind on which Christians base their belief. To do that would be to write a full-dress apologia. All that I need do here is to point out that, at the very worst, this evidence cannot be so weak as to warrant the view that all whom it convinces are indifferent to evidence. The history of thought seems to make this quite plain. We know, in fact, that believers are not cut off from unbelievers by any portentous inferiority of intelligence or any perverse refusal to think. Many of them have been people of powerful minds. Many of them have been scientists. We may suppose them to have been mistaken, but we must suppose that their error was at least plausible. We might indeed conclude that it was merely from the multitude and diversity of the arguments against it. For there is not one case against religion, but many. Some say, like Capaneus in Statius, that it is a projection of our primitive fears. Primus in orbe Deus fecit timor. Others, with Euhemeros, that it is all a plant put up by wicked kings, priests, or capitalists. Others, with Tyler, that it comes from dreams about the dead. Others, with Fraser, that it is a byproduct of agriculture. Others, like Freud, that it is a complex. The moderns, that it is a category mistake. I will never believe that an error against which so many and various defensive weapons have been found necessary was, from the outset, wholly lacking in plausibility. All this post-haste and rummage in the land obviously implies a respectable enemy. There are, of course, people in our own day to whom the whole situation seems altered by the doctrine of the concealed wish. They will admit that men, otherwise apparently rational, have been deceived by the arguments for religion. But they will say that they have been deceived first by their own desires and produced the arguments afterwards as a rationalization. That these arguments have never been intrinsically even plausible, but have seemed so because they were secretly weighted by our wishes. Now, I do not doubt that this sort of thing happens in thinking about religion as in thinking about other things. But as a general explanation of religious assent, it seems to me quite useless. On that issue, our wishes may favor either side or both. The assumption that every man would be pleased, and nothing but pleased if only he could conclude that Christianity is true, appears to me to be simply preposterous. If Freud is right about the Oedipus complex, the universal pressure of the wish that God should not exist must be enormous, and atheism must be an admirable gratification to one of our strongest suppressed impulses. This argument, in fact, could be used on the theistic side, but I have no intention of so using it. It will not really help either party. It is fatally ambivalent. Men wish on both sides, and again there is fear, fulfillment, as well as wish fulfillment, and hypochondriac temperaments will always tend to think true what they most wish to be false. Thus, instead of the one predicament on which our opponents sometimes concentrate, there are in fact four. A man may be a Christian because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants atheism to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be a Christian because he wants atheism to be true. Surely these possibilities cancel one another out. They may be of some use in analyzing a particular instance of belief or disbelief where we know the case history, but as a general explanation of either, they will not help us. I do not think they overthrow the view that there is evidence both for and against the Christian propositions which fully rational minds, working honestly, can assess differently. I therefore ask you to substitute a different and less tidy picture for that with which we began. In it, you remember, two different kinds of men, scientists, who proportioned their belief to the evidence, and Christians who did not, were left facing one another across a chasm. The picture I should prefer is like this. All men alike, on questions which interest them, escape from the region of belief into that of knowledge when they can, and if they succeed in knowing, they no longer say they believe. The questions in which mathematicians are interested admit of treatment by a particularly clear and a strict technique. Those of the scientist have their own technique, which is not quite the same. Those of the historian and the judge are different again. The mathematician's proof, at least so we laymen suppose, is by reasoning, the scientists by experiment, the historians by documents, the judges by concurring sworn testimony. But all these men, as men, on questions outside their own disciplines, have numerous beliefs to which they do not normally apply the methods of their own disciplines. It would indeed carry some suspicion of morbidity and even of insanity if they did. These beliefs vary in strength from weak opinion to complete subjective certitude. Specimens of such beliefs at their strongest are the Christians I believe and the convinced atheists I don't believe a word of it. The particular subject matter on which these two disagree does not, of course, necessarily involve such strength of belief and disbelief. There are some who moderately opine that there is or is not a God, but there are others whose belief or disbelief is free from doubt, and all these beliefs, weak or strong, are based on what appears to the holders to be evidence. But the strong believers or disbelievers, of course, think they have very strong evidence. There is no need to suppose stark unreason on either side. We need only suppose error. One side has estimated the evidence wrongly, and even so, the mistake cannot be supposed to be of a flagrant nature. Otherwise, the debate would not continue. So much, then, for the way in which Christians come to assent to certain propositions. But we have now to consider something quite different: their adherence to their belief after it has once been formed. It is here that the charge of irrationality and resistance to evidence becomes really important. For it must be admitted at once the Christians do praise such an adherence as if it were meritorious, and even in a sense, more meritorious the stronger the apparent evidence against their faith becomes. They even warn one another that such apparent contrary evidence, such trials to faith or temptations to doubt, may be expected to occur, and determine in advance to resist them. And this is certainly shockingly unlike the behavior we all demand of the scientist or the historian in their own disciplines. There, to slur over or ignore the faintest evidence against a favorite hypothesis is admittedly foolish and shameful. It must be exposed to every test. Every doubt must be invited. But then I do not admit that a hypothesis is a belief. And if we consider the scientist not among his hypotheses in the laboratory, but among the beliefs in his ordinary life, I think the contrast between him and the Christian would be weakened. If, for the first time, a doubt of his wife's fidelity crosses the scientist's mind, does he consider it his duty at once to entertain this doubt with complete impartiality? At once, to evolve a series of experiments by which it can be tested and to await the result with pure neutrality of mind? No doubt it may come to that in the end. There are unfaithful wives. There are experimental husbands. But is such a course what his brother scientists would recommend to him? All of them, I suppose, except one. As the first step he should take, and the only one consistent with his honor as a scientist? Or would they, like us, blame him for a moral flaw rather than praise him for an intellectual virtue if he did so? This is intended, however, merely as a precaution against exaggerating the difference between Christian obstinacy in belief and the behavior of normal people about their non-theological beliefs. I am far from suggesting that the case I have supposed is exactly parallel to the Christian obstinacy. For of course evidence of the wife's infidelity might accumulate and presently reach a point at which the scientist would be pitiably foolish to disbelieve it. But the Christians seem to praise an adherence to the original belief which holds out against any evidence whatever. I must now try to show why such praise is in fact a logical conclusion from the original belief itself. This can be done best by thinking for a moment of situations in which the thing is reversed. In Christianity, such faith is demanded of us, but there are situations in which we demand it of others. There are times when we can do all that a fellow creature needs, if only he will trust us. In getting a dog out of a trap, in extracting a thorn from a child's finger, in teaching a boy to swim or rescuing one who can't, in getting a frightened beginner over a nasty place on a mountain. The one fatal obstacle may be their distrust. We are asking them to trust us in the teeth of their senses, their imagination, and their intelligence. We ask them to believe that what is painful will relieve their pain, and that what looks dangerous is their only safety. We ask them to accept apparent impossibility, that moving the paw farther back into the trap is the way to get it out, that hurting the finger very much more will stop the finger hurting, that water, which is obviously permeable, will resist and support the body, that holding on to the only support within reach is not the way to avoid sinking, that to go higher and onto a more exposed ledge is the way not to fall. To support all these incredibilia, we can rely only on the other party's confidence in us, a confidence certainly not based on demonstration, admittedly shot through with emotion, and perhaps if we are strangers, resting on nothing but such assurance, as the look of our face and the tone of our voice can supplete, or even, for the dog, on our smell. Sometimes, because of their unbelief, we can do no mighty works. But if we succeed, we do so because they have maintained their faith in us against apparently contrary evidence. No one blames us for demanding such faith. No one blames them for giving it. No one says afterwards, "What an unintelligent dog or child or boy that must have been to trust us." If the young mountaineer were a scientist, it would not be held against him when he came up for a fellowship that he had once departed from Clifford's rule of evidence by entertaining a belief with strength greater than the evidence logically obliged him to. Now, to accept the Christian propositions is ipso facto to believe that we are to God, always, as that dog or child or brother or mountain climber was to us, only very much more so. From this, it is a strictly logical conclusion that the behavior which was appropriate to them will be appropriate to us, only very much more so. Mark, I am not saying that the strength of our original belief must, by psychological necessity, produce such behavior. I am saying that the content of our original belief, by logical necessity, entails the proposition that such behavior is appropriate. If human life is in fact ordered by a beneficent being whose knowledge of our real needs and of the way in which they can be satisfied infinitely exceeds our own, we must expect a priori that his operations will often appear to us far from beneficent and far from wise, and that it will be our highest prudence to give him our confidence in spite of this. This expectation is increased by the fact that when we accept Christianity, we are warned that apparent evidence against it will occur, evidence strong enough to deceive, if possible, the very elect. Our situation is rendered tolerable by two facts. One is that we seem to ourselves, besides the apparently contrary evidence, to receive favorable evidence. Some of it is in the form of external events, as when I go to see a man moved by what I felt to be a whim, and find he has been praying that I should come to him that day. Some of it is more like the evidence on which the mountaineer or the dog might trust his rescuer, the rescuer's voice, look, and smell. For it seems to us, though you, on your premises, must believe us deluded, that we have something like a knowledge by acquaintance of the person we believe in, however imperfect and intermittent it may be. We trust not because a God exists, but because this God exists. Or if we ourselves dare not claim to know him, Christendom does, and we trust at least some of its representatives in the same way because of the sort of people they are. The second fact is this: we think we can see already. Why? If our original belief is true, such trust beyond the evidence, against much apparent evidence, has to be demanded of us. For the question is not about being helped out of one trap or over one difficult place in a climb. We believe that his intention is to create a certain personal relation between himself and us, a relation really sui generis, but analogically describable in terms of filial or of erotic love. Complete trust is an ingredient in that relation. Such trust as could have no room to grow except where there is also room for doubt. To love involves trusting the beloved beyond the evidence, even against much evidence. No man is our friend who believes in our good intentions only when they are proved. No man is our friend who will not be very slow to accept evidence against them. Such confidence between one man and another is in fact almost universally praised as a moral beauty, not blamed as a logical error, and the suspicious man is blamed for a meanness of character, not admired for the excellence of his logic. There is, you see, no real parallel between Christian obstinacy in faith and the obstinacy of a bad scientist trying to preserve a hypothesis, although the evidence has turned against it. Unbelievers very pardonably get the impression that an adherence to our faith is like that, because they meet Christianity, if at all, mainly in apologetic works. And there, of course, the existence and beneficence of God must appear as a speculative question like any other. Indeed, it is a speculative question as long as it is a question at all. But once it has been answered in the affirmative, you get quite a new situation. To believe that God, at least this God, exists, is to believe that you as a person now stand in the presence of God as a person. What would, a moment before, have been variations in opinion, now become variations in your personal attitude to a person. You are no longer faced with an argument which demands your assent, but with a person who demands your confidence. A faint analogy would be this: it is one thing to ask in vacuo whether so-and-so will join us tonight, and another to discuss this when so-and-so's honor is pledged to come, and some great matter depends on his coming. In the first case, it would be merely reasonable, as the clock ticked on, to expect him less and less. In the second, a continued expectation, far into the night, would be due to our friend's character, if we had found him reliable before. Which of us would not feel slightly ashamed if one moment after we had given him up, he arrived with a full explanation of his delay? We should feel that we ought to have known him better. Now, of course, we see, quite as clearly as you, how agonizingly two-edged all this is. A faith of this sort, if it happens to be true, is obviously what we need, and it's infinitely ruinous to lack it. But there can be faith of this sort, where it is wholly ungrounded. The dog may lick the face of the man who comes to take it out of the trap, but the man may only mean to vivisect it in South Park's Road when he has done so. The ducks who come to the call, dilly dilly, come and be killed, have confidence in the farmer's wife, and she wrings their necks for their pains. There is that famous French story of the fire in the theater. Panic was spreading. The spectators were just turning from an audience into a mob. At that moment, a huge bearded man leaped through the orchestra onto the stage, raised his hand with a gesture full of nobility, and cried, "Que chacun regagne sa place." Such was the authority of his voice and bearing that everyone obeyed him. As a result, they were all burned to death, while the bearded man walked quietly out through the wings to the stage door, took a cab, which was waiting for someone else, and went home to bed. That demand for our confidence, which a true friend makes of us, is exactly the same that a confidence trickster would make. That refusal to trust, which is sensible in reply to a confidence trickster, is ungenerous and ignoble to a friend, and deeply damaging to our relation with him. To be forewarned and therefore forearmed against apparently contrary appearance is eminently rational if our belief is true. But if our belief is a delusion, this same forewarning and forearming would obviously be the method whereby the delusion rendered itself incurable. And yet again, to be aware of these possibilities and still to reject them is clearly the precise mode, and the only mode, in which our personal response to God can establish itself. In that sense, the ambiguity is not something that conflicts with faith so much as a condition which makes faith possible. When you are asked for trust, you may give it or withhold it. It is senseless to say that you will trust if you are given demonstrative certainty. There would be no room for trust if demonstration were given. When demonstration is given, what will be left will be simply the sort of relation which results from having trusted or not having trusted before it was given. The saying, "Blessed are those that have not seen and have believed," has nothing to do with our original assent to the Christian propositions. It was not addressed to a philosopher inquiring whether God exists. It was addressed to a man who already believed that, who already had long acquaintance with a particular person, and evidence that that person could do very odd things, and who then refused to believe one odd thing more, often predicted by that person, and vouched for by all his closest friends. It is a rebuke not to skepticism in the philosophic sense, but to the psychological quality of being suspicious. It says, in effect, "You should have known me better." There are cases between man and man where we should all, in our different way, bless those who have not seen and have believed. Our relation to those who trusted us only after we were proved innocent in court cannot be the same as our relation to those who trusted us all through. Our opponents, then, have a perfect right to dispute with us about the grounds of our original assent, but they must not accuse us of sheer insanity if, after the assent has been given, our adherence to it is no longer proportioned to every fluctuation of the apparent evidence. They cannot, of course, be expected to know on what our assurance feeds and how it revives and is always rising from its ashes. They cannot be expected to see how the quality of the object which we think we are beginning to know by acquaintance drives us to the view that if this were a delusion, then we should have to say that the universe had produced no real thing of comparable value, and that all explanations of the delusion seem somehow less important than the thing explained. That is knowledge we cannot communicate, but they can see how the assent of necessity moves us from the logic of speculative thought into what might perhaps be called the logic of personal relations. What would, up till then, have been variations simply of opinion become variations of conduct by a person to a person. Credere deum esse turns into credere in deum, and deum here is this God, the increasingly knowable Lord. Some years ago, I got up one morning intending to have my hair cut in preparation for a visit to London, and the first letter I opened made it clear I need not go to London. So I decided to put the haircut off too. But then there began the most unaccountable little nagging in my mind, almost like a voice saying, "Get it cut all the same. Go and get it cut." In the end, I could stand it no longer. I went. Now my barber at that time was a fellow Christian, and a man of many troubles, whom my brother and I had sometimes been able to help. The moment I opened his shop door, he said, "Oh, I was praying you might come today." And in fact, if I had come a day or so later, I should have been of no use to him. It awed me. It awes me still. But of course, one cannot rigorously prove a causal connection between the barber's prayers and my visit. It might be telepathy. It might be accident. I have stood by the bedside of a woman whose thigh bone was eaten through with cancer, and who had thriving colonies of the disease in many other bones as well. It took 3 people to move her in bed. The doctors predicted a few months of life, the nurses, who often know better. A few weeks, a good man laid his hands on her and prayed. A year later, the patient was walking, uphill too, through rough woodland, and the man who took the last X-ray photos was saying, "These bones are as solid as rock. It's miraculous." But once again, there is no rigorous proof. Medicine, as all true doctors admit, is not an exact science. We need not invoke the supernatural to explain the falsification of its prophecies. You need not, unless you choose, believe in a causal connection between the prayers and the recovery. The question then arises, what sort of evidence would prove the efficacy of prayer? The thing we pray for may happen, but how can you ever know it was not going to happen anyway? Even if the thing were indisputably miraculous, it would not follow that the miracle had occurred because of your prayers. The answer surely is that a compulsive empirical proof, such as we have in the sciences, can never be attained. Some things are proved by the unbroken uniformity of our experiences. The law of gravitation is established by the fact that, in our experience, all bodies without exception obey it. Now, even if all the things that people prayed for happened, which they do not, this would not prove what Christians mean by the efficacy of prayer. For prayer is request. The essence of request, as distinct from compulsion, is that it may or may not be granted. And if an infinitely wise being listens to the requests of finite and foolish creatures, of course, he will sometimes grant and sometimes refuse them. Invariable success in prayer would not prove the Christian doctrine at all. It would prove something much more like magic, a power in certain human beings to control or compel the course of nature. There are no doubt passages in the New Testament which may seem at first sight to promise an invariable granting of our prayers, but that cannot be what they really mean. For in the very heart of the story, we meet a glaring instance to the contrary. In Gethsemane, the holiest of all petitioners prayed 3 times that a certain cup might pass from him. It did not. After that, the idea that prayer is recommended to us as a sort of infallible gimmick may be dismissed. Other things are proved not simply by experience, but by those artificially contrived experiences which we call experiments. Could this be done about prayer? I will pass over the objection that no Christian could take part in such a project, because he has been forbidden it. You must not try experiments on God, your master. Forbidden or not, is the thing even possible? I have seen it suggested that a team of people, the more the better, should agree to pray as hard as they knew how over a period of 6 weeks for all the patients in Hospital A and none of those in Hospital B. Then you would tot up the results and see if A had more cures and fewer deaths. And I suppose you would repeat the experiment at various times and places so as to eliminate the influence of irrelevant factors. The trouble is that I do not see how any real prayer could go on under such conditions. Words without thoughts never to heaven go, says the king in Hamlet. Simply to say prayers is not to pray. Otherwise, a team of properly trained parrots would serve as well as men for our experiment. You cannot pray for the recovery of the sick unless the end you have in view is their recovery. But you can have no motive for desiring the recovery of all the patients in one hospital and none of those in another. You are not doing it in order that suffering should be relieved. You are doing it to find out what happens. The real purpose and the nominal purpose of your prayers are at variance. In other words, whatever your tongue and teeth and knees may do, you are not praying. The experiment demands an impossibility. Empirical proof and disproof are then unobtainable. But this conclusion will seem less depressing if we remember that prayer is request and compare it with other specimens of the same thing. We make requests of our fellow creatures as well as of God. We ask for the salt. We ask for a raise in pay. We ask a friend to feed the cat. While we are on our holidays, we ask a woman to marry us. Sometimes we get what we ask for, and sometimes not. But when we do, it is not nearly so easy as one might suppose to prove with scientific certainty a causal connection between the asking and the getting. Your neighbor may be a humane person who would not have let your cat starve even if you had forgotten to make any arrangement. Your employer is never so likely to grant your request for a raise as when he is aware that you could get better money from a rival firm and is quite possibly intending to secure you by a raise in any case. As for the lady who consents to marry you, are you sure she had not decided to do so already? Your proposal, might have been the result, not the cause, of her decision. A certain important conversation might never have taken place unless she had intended that it should. Thus, in some measure, the same doubt that hangs about the causal efficacy of our prayers to God hangs also about our prayers to man. Whatever we get, we might have been going to get anyway. But only, as I say, in some measure, our friend, boss, and wife may tell us that they acted because we asked, and we may know them so well as to feel sure, first, that they are saying what they believe to be true, and secondly, that they understand their own motives well enough to be right. But notice that when this happens, our assurance has not been gained by the methods of science. We do not try the control experiment of refusing the raise or breaking off the engagement and then making our request again under fresh conditions. Our assurance is quite different in kind from scientific knowledge. It is born out of our personal relation to the other parties, not from knowing things about them, but from knowing them. Our assurance, if we reach an assurance, that God always hears and sometimes grants our prayers, and that apparent grantings are not merely fortuitous, can only come in the same sort of way. There can be no question of tabulating successes and failures, and trying to decide whether the successes are too numerous to be accounted for by chance. Those who best know a man best know whether when he did what they asked, he did it because they asked. I think those who best know God will best know whether he sent me to the barber's shop because the barber prayed. For up till now, we have been tackling the whole question in the wrong way and on the wrong level. The very question, does prayer work, puts us in the wrong frame of mind from the outset. Work, as if it were magic or a machine, something that functions automatically. Prayer is either a sheer illusion or a personal contact between embryonic, incomplete persons, ourselves, and the utterly concrete person. Prayer, in the sense of petition, asking for things, is a small part of it. Confession and penitence are its threshold. Adoration its sanctuary. The presence and vision and enjoyment of God its bread and wine. In it, God shows himself to us. That he answers prayers is a corollary, not necessarily the most important one. From that revelation, what he does is learned from what he is. Petitionary prayer is, nonetheless, both allowed and commanded to us. Give us our daily bread, and no doubt it raises a theoretical problem. Can we believe that God ever really modifies his action in response to the suggestions of men? For infinite wisdom does not need telling what is best, and infinite goodness needs no urging to do it. But neither does God need any of those things that are done by finite agents, whether living or inanimate. He could, if he chose, repair our bodies miraculously without food, or give us food without the aid of farmers, bakers, and butchers, or knowledge without the aid of learned men, or convert the heathen without missionaries. Instead, he allows soils and weather and animals and the muscles, minds, and wills of men to cooperate in the execution of his will. God, said Pascal, instituted prayer in order to lend to his creatures the dignity of causality. But not only prayer. Whenever we act at all, he lends us that dignity. It is not really stranger, nor less strange, that my prayers should affect the course of events than that my other actions should do so. They have not advised or changed God's mind, that is, his overall purpose. But that purpose will be realized in different ways, according to the actions, including the prayers, of his creatures. For he seemed to do nothing of himself which he can possibly delegate to his creatures. He commands us to do slowly and blunderingly what he could do perfectly and in the twinkling of an eye. He allows us to neglect what he would have us do, or to fail. Perhaps we do not fully realize the problem, so to call it, of enabling finite free wills to coexist with omnipotence. It seems to involve at every moment almost a sort of divine abdication. We are not mere recipients or spectators. We are either privileged to share in the game or compelled to collaborate in the work, to wield our little tridents. Is this amazing process simply creation going on before our eyes? This is how, no light matter, God makes something, indeed makes God, out of nothing. So at least it seems to me. But what I have offered can be, at the very best, only a mental model or symbol. All that we say on such subjects must be merely analogical and parabolic. The reality is doubtless not comprehensible by our faculties, but we can at any rate try to expel bad analogies and bad parables. Prayer is not a machine. It is not magic. It is not advice offered to God. Our act when we pray must not, any more than all our other acts, be separated from the continuous act of God himself, in which alone all finite causes operate. It would be even worse to think of those who get what they pray for as a sort of court favorites, people who have influence with the throne. The refused prayer of Christ in Gethsemane is answer enough to that. And I dare not leave out the hard saying, which I once heard from an experienced Christian. I have seen many striking answers to prayer, and more than one that I thought miraculous. But they usually come at the beginning, before conversion, or soon after it. As the Christian life proceeds, they tend to be rarer. The refusals, too, are not only more frequent, they become more unmistakable, more emphatic. Does God then forsake just those who serve him best? Well, he who served him best of all said near his tortured death, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" When God becomes man, that man of all others is least comforted by God at his greatest need. There is a mystery here which, even if I had the power, I might not have the courage to explore. Meanwhile, Little people like you and me, if our prayers are sometimes granted, beyond all hope and probability, had better not draw hasty conclusions to our own advantage. If we were stronger, we might be less tenderly treated. If we were braver, we might be sent with far less help to defend far more desperate posts in the great battle. In my time, I have heard two quite different arguments against my religion put forward in the name of science. When I was a youngster, people used to say that the universe was not only not friendly to life, but positively hostile to it. Life had appeared on this planet by a millionth chance, as if at one point there had been a breakdown of the elaborate defenses generally enforced against it. We should be rash to assume that such a leak had occurred more than once. Probably life was a purely terrestrial abnormality. We were alone in an infinite desert, which just showed the absurdity of the Christian idea that there was a creator who was interested in living creatures. But then came Professor F.B. Hoyle, the Cambridge cosmologist, and in a fortnight or so, everyone I met seemed to have decided that the universe was probably quite well provided with inhabitable globes and with livestock to inhabit them, which just showed, equally well, the absurdity of Christianity with its parochial idea that man could be important to God. This is a warning of what we may expect if we ever do discover animal life, vegetable does not matter, on another planet. Each new discovery, even every new theory, is held at first to have the most wide-reaching theological and philosophical consequences. It is seized by unbelievers as the basis for a new attack on Christianity. It is often, and more embarrassingly, seized by injudicious believers as the basis for a new defense. But usually, when the popular hubbub has subsided and the novelty has been chewed over by real theologians, real scientists, and real philosophers, both sides find themselves pretty much where they were before. So it was with Copernican astronomy, with Darwinism, with biblical criticism, with the new psychology. So I cannot help expecting it will be with the discovery of life on other planets, if that discovery is ever made. The supposed threat is clearly directed against the doctrine of the incarnation, the belief that God of God, for us men and for our salvation, came down from heaven and was made man. Why for us men more than for others? If we find ourselves to be but one among a million races, scattered through a million spheres, how can we, without absurd arrogance, believe ourselves to have been uniquely favored? I admit that the question could become formidable. In fact, it will become formidable when, if ever, we know the answer to 5 other questions. 1. Are there animals anywhere except on Earth? We do not know. We do not know whether we ever shall know. 2. Supposing there were, have any of these animals what we call rational souls? By this I include not merely the faculty to abstract and calculate, but the apprehension of values, the power to mean by good something more than good for me, or even good for my species. If, instead of asking, have they rational souls, you prefer to ask, are they spiritual animals? I think we shall both mean pretty much the same. If the answer to either question should be no, then of course it would not be at all strange that our species should be treated differently from theirs. There would be no sense in offering to a creature, however clever or amiable, a gift which that creature was, by its nature, incapable either of desiring or of receiving. We teach our sons to read, but not our dogs. The dogs prefer bones. And of course, since we do not yet know whether there are extraterrestrial animals at all, we are a long way from knowing that they are rational or spiritual. Even if we met them, we might not find it so easy to decide. It seems to me possible to suppose creatures so clever that they could talk, though they were, from the theological point of view, really only animals, capable of pursuing or enjoying only natural ends. One meets humans, the machine-minded and materialistic urban type, who look as if they were just that. As Christians, we must believe the appearance to be false. Somewhere under that glib surface there lurks, however atrophied, a human soul. But in other worlds, there might be things that really are what these seem to be. Conversely, there might be creatures genuinely spiritual, whose powers of manufacture and abstract thought were so humble that we should mistake them for mere animals. God shield them from us. 3. If there are species, and a rational species other than man, are any or all of them, like us, fallen? This is the point non-Christians always seem to forget. They seem to think that the incarnation implies some particular merit or excellence in humanity. But of course it implies just the reverse, a particular demerit and depravity. No creature that deserved redemption would need to be redeemed. They that are whole need not the physician. Christ died for men precisely because men are not worth dying for, to make them worth it. Notice what waves of utterly unwarranted hypothesis these critics of Christianity want us to swim through. We are now supposing the fall of hypothetically rational creatures whose mere existence is hypothetical. 4. If all of them, and surely all is a long shot, or any of them have fallen, have they been denied redemption by the incarnation and passion of Christ? For of course it is no very new idea that the eternal Son may, for all we know, have been incarnate in other worlds than earth, and so saved other races than ours. As Alice Meynell wrote in Christ in the Universe, in the eternity, doubtless we shall compare together. Here a million alien gospels in what guise? He trod the Pleiad, the lyre, the bear. I wouldn't go as far as doubtless myself. Perhaps of all races we only fell. Perhaps man is the only lost sheep, the one, therefore, whom the shepherd came to seek. Or perhaps, but this brings us to the next wave of assumption. It is the biggest yet, and will knock us head over heels, but I am fond of a tumble in the surf. 5. If we knew, which we don't, the answers to 1, 2, and 3, and further, if we knew that redemption, by an incarnation and passion, had been denied to creatures in need of it, is it certain that this is the only mode of redemption that is possible? Here, of course, we ask for what is not merely unknown, but, unless God should reveal it, wholly unknowable. It may be that the further we were permitted to see into his counsels, the more clearly we should understand that, thus and not otherwise, by the birth at Bethlehem, the cross on Calvary, and the empty tomb, a fallen race could be rescued. There may be a necessity for this, insurmountable, rooted in the very nature of God and the very nature of sin. But we don't know. At any rate, I don't know. Spiritual as well as physical conditions might differ widely in different worlds. There might be different sorts and different degrees of fallenness, we must surely believe that the divine charity is as fertile in resource as it is measureless in condescension. To different diseases, or even to different patients sick with the same disease, the great physician may have appelé different remedies, which we should probably not recognize as such even if we ever hear of them. It might turn out that the redemption of other species differed from ours by working through ours. There is a hint of something like this in St. Paul, Romans 8:19-23, when he says that the whole creation is longing and waiting to be delivered from some kind of slavery, and that the deliverance will occur only when we Christians, fully enter upon our sonship to God and exercise our glorious liberty. On the conscious level, I believe that he was thinking only of our own earth, of animal and probably vegetable, life on earth being renewed or glorified as the glorification of man in Christ. But it is perhaps possible, it is not necessary, to give his words a cosmic meaning. It may be that redemption, starting with us, is to work from us and through us. This would no doubt give man a pivotal position, but such a position need not imply any superiority in us or any favoritism in God. The general, deciding where to begin his attack, does not select the prettiest landscape or the most fertile field or the most attractive village. Christ was not born in a stable because a stable is, in itself, the most convenient or distinguished place for a maternity. Only if we had some such function would a contact between us and such unknown races be other than a calamity. If indeed we were unfallen, it would be another matter. It sets one dreaming. To interchange thoughts with beings whose thinking had an organic background wholly different from ours, other senses, other appetites, to be unenviously humbled by intellect possibly superior to our own, yet able for that very reason to descend to our level, to descend lovingly ourselves, if we met innocent and childlike creatures who could never be as strong or as clever as we, to exchange with the inhabitants of other worlds that especially keen and rich affection which exists between unlikes. It is a glorious dream, but make no mistake, it is a dream. We are fallen. We know what our race does to strangers. Man destroys or enslaves every species he can. Civilized man murders, enslaves, cheats, and corrupts savage man. Even inanimate nature he turns into dust bowls and slag heaps. There are individuals who don't, but they are not the sort who are likely to be our pioneers in space. Our ambassador to new worlds will be the needy and greedy adventurer, or the ruthless technical expert. They will do as their kind has always done. What that will be if they meet things weaker than themselves, the black man and the red man can tell. If they meet things stronger, they will be, very properly, destroyed. It is interesting to wonder how things would go if they met an unfallen race. At first, to be sure, they'd have a grand time jeering at, duping, and exploiting its innocence. But I doubt if our half-animal cunning would long be a match for godlike wisdom, selfless valor, and perfect unanimity. I therefore fear the practical, not the theoretical, problems which will arise if ever we meet rational creatures which are not human. Against them we shall, if we can, commit all the crimes we have already committed against creatures certainly human, but differing from us in features and pigmentation. and the starry heavens will become an object to which good men can look up only with feelings of intolerable guilt, agonized pity, and burning shame. Of course, after the first debauch of exploitation, we shall make some belated attempt to do better. We shall perhaps send missionaries. But can even missionaries be trusted? Gun and gospel have been horribly combined in the past. The missionaries' holy desire to save souls has not always been kept quite distinct from the arrogant desire the busybodies itch to, as he calls it, civilize the, as he calls them, natives. Would all our missionaries recognize an unfallen race if they met it? Could they? Would they continue to press upon creatures that did not need to be saved, that plan of salvation which God has appointed for man? Would they denounce as sins mere differences of behavior which the spiritual and biological history of these strange creatures fully justified and which God himself had blessed? Would they try to teach those from whom they had better learn? I do not know. What I do know is that here and now, as our only possible practical preparation for such a meeting, you and I should resolve to stand firm against all exploitation and all theological imperialism. It will not be fun. We shall be called traitors to our own species. We shall be hated of almost all men, even of some religious men. And we must not give back one single inch. We shall probably fail, but let us go down fighting for the right side. Our loyalty is due not to our species, but to God. Those who are or can become his sons are our real brothers, even if they have shells or tusks. It is spiritual, not biological, kinship that counts. But let us thank God that we are still very far from travel to other worlds. I have wondered before now whether the vast astronomical distances may not be God's quarantine precautions. They prevent the spiritual infection of a fallen species from spreading. And of course, we are also very far from the supposed theological problem which contact with other rational species might raise. Such species may not exist. There is not at present a shred of empirical evidence that they do. There is nothing but what the logicians would call arguments from a priori probability. Arguments that begin, it is only natural to suppose, or all analogy suggests, or is it not the height of arrogance to rule out? They make very good reading. But who, except a born gambler, ever risks $5 on such grounds in ordinary life? And, as we have seen, the mere existence of these creatures would not raise a problem. After that, we still need to know that they are fallen, then that they have not been, or will not be, redeemed in the mode we know, and then that no other mode is possible. I think a Christian is sitting pretty if his faith never encounters more formidable difficulties than these conjectural phantoms. If I remember rightly, St. Augustine raised a question about the theological position of satyrs, monopods, and other semi-human creatures. He decided it could wait till we knew there were any. So can this. But supposing, you say, supposing all these embarrassing suppositions turned out to be true, I can only record a conviction that they won't, a conviction which has, for me, become, in the course of years, irresistible. Christians and their opponents again and again expect that some new discovery will either turn matters of faith into matters of knowledge, or else reduce them to patent absurdities. But it has never happened. What we believe always remains intellectually possible. It never becomes intellectually compulsive. I have an idea that when this ceases to be so, the world will be ending, we have been warned that all but conclusive evidence against Christianity, evidence that would deceive, if it were possible, the very elect, will appear with Antichrist. And after that there will be wholly conclusive evidence on the other side, but not, I fancy, till then on either side. It's the contemplation of democracy and its most pivotal mechanism, the election. One might find oneself musing upon the grand tapestry of human governance through the ages. It is in the democratic process, with all its inherent imperfections and glories, that we see a reflection of humanity's ceaseless pursuit of equality and liberty. Elections, those regular ceremonies of civic duty, stand as the cornerstone of democracy, embodying the profound principle that governance should echo the will of the people. Yet, to consider elections merely as a mechanism of choice would be to overlook the deeper, more intricate dance of virtues and vices they represent. In democracy, and through its elections, we see the unfolding of a great drama, a reflection of the human soul's capacity for both nobility and fallibility. For what is an election, if not a collective act of faith? Faith in the common man's wisdom, in the idea that out of the many, a just and wise decision can emerge. This is not to say that the process is without its flaws. Much like the mythical creatures of Narnia, elections are not immune to corruption and deceit. They can be swayed by the darker inclinations of man. Greed, power, and the lure of authoritarianism. Yet, in the very act of voting, in the participation in this grand democratic ritual, there is a counter charm against the descent into tyranny. Each ballot cast is both an act of hope and a declaration that no one man should hold unchecked power over another. Moreover, elections serve as a mirror, reflecting back to us not only who we are as a society at a given moment, but also who we aspire to be. They are the means by which we navigate the choppy waters of societal change, steering the ship of state with the collective hands of its citizens. It is through this process that we engage in a dialogue with the past and the future, deciding not just on a leader, but on the direction in which we wish our society to move. Yet, one must not fall into the trap of idolizing democracy or its institutions as perfect. Democracy, for all its virtues, is but a human system. It is susceptible to human failings and requires vigilance, participation, and a commitment to principle over convenience or expediency. In the end, the nature of elections in democracy speaks to a deeper truth about the human condition. It is through these communal acts of decision-making that we express our inherent longing for justice, community, and the good. Elections are a testament to our belief in the possibility of a better world, crafted not from the top down by the dictates of a single ruler, but from the bottom up, through the collective will and wisdom of the people. As we partake in this democratic ritual, let us do so with a sense of humility and responsibility, mindful of the trust that has been placed in our hands. For in the end, democracy and its elections are not just about choosing leaders, they are about affirming our commitment to the journey towards a more just and equitable society. Let us, therefore, approach the ballot box not as mere participants in a political process, but as custodians of a precious heritage, tasked with nurturing the fragile flame of liberty for generations to come. Until quite modern times, I think until the time of the Romantics, nobody ever suggested that literature and the arts were an end in themselves. They belonged to the ornamental part of life. They provided innocent diversion, or else they refined our manners, or incited youth to virtue, or glorified the gods. The great music had been written for masses. The great picture is painted to fill, of a space on the wall, of a noble patron's dining room, or to kindle devotion in a church. The great tragedies were produced either by religious poets in honor of Dionysus, or by commercial poets to entertain Londoners on half holidays. It was only in the 19th century that we became aware of the full dignity of art. We began to take it seriously. But the result seems to have been a dislocation of the aesthetic life in which little is left for us but high-minded works which fewer and fewer people want to read or hear or see, and popular works of which both those who make them and those who enjoy them are half ashamed. By valuing too highly a real but subordinate good, we have come near to losing that good itself. The longer I looked into it, the more I came to suspect that I was perceiving a universal law. The woman who makes a dog the center of her life loses, in the end, not only her human usefulness and dignity, but even the proper pleasure of dog keeping. The man who makes alcohol his chief good loses not only his job, but his palate and all power of enjoying the earlier and only pleasurable levels of intoxication. It is a glorious thing to feel, for a moment or two, that the whole meaning of the universe is summed up in one woman. Glorious, so long as other duties and pleasures keep tearing you away from her. But clear the decks, and so arrange your life, it is sometimes feasible, that you will have nothing to do but contemplate her, and what happens? Of course, this law has been discovered before, but it will stand rediscovery. It may be stated as follows. Every preference of a small good to a great, or partial good to a total good, involves the loss of the small or partial good for which the sacrifice is made. Apparently, the world is made that way. You can't get second things by putting them first. You can get second things only by putting first things first.